But our next speaker is Melanie Herrera. And Melanie came to this program with experience in communication and ocean policy. She is most passionate about centering conservation around people, and so she is excited that her project works to transform climate action planning in a way that leads with climate equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion. She's excited to pursue a lifelong career in ocean policy where she can work to elevate Black, Indigenous, people of color representation, voices, and leadership in marine conservation. And the name of her presentation today is Championing Communities, Restoring Nature, Blue Carbon Strategies for Climate Action and Equitable Conservation.
Thank you, Samantha. Did you know that Black and African American individuals are 40% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected increases in death rates due to extreme temperatures? Or that Hispanic and Latinx individuals are 43% more likely to live in areas with the highest loss of labor hours in weather-exposed industries due to high temperatures? And lastly, that American Indian and Alaska Native individuals are 48% more likely to live in areas where the highest percentage of land will be lost due to sea level rise. In 2021, the EPA released a report on climate change and social vulnerability in the US. As we've just seen, they found that minorities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. San Diego is already experiencing the impacts of climate change. From warming temperatures, to rising sea levels, to more extreme weather events like increased drought. These impacts affect all communities, but they do not affect them in the same way. Low income and Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, communities bear the brunt of climate change around the world. In response to this climate crisis, the County of San Diego is currently drafting a new climate action plan to more aggressively tackle greenhouse gas emission reductions. Currently, this plan focuses on decarbonizing facilities, vehicles, public transit, and other industrial sectors. But there's a vital missing piece: the use of blue carbon ecosystems as natural climate solutions. First and foremost, why does blue carbon matter? Blue carbon is carbon that is absorbed and stored naturally by marine and coastal ecosystems, like coastal wetlands. Carbon is taken up through plants via photosynthesis, buried in soils, and stored in the ground for millennia. Blue carbon ecosystems are estimated to sequester as much carbon as, or in some cases, even more carbon than, global terrestrial forest. So with this knowledge, how can we help the county tackle such a mighty feat? And that's where I came in. I set out to create a guidance document that helps the county transform climate action in a way that, one, best mitigates carbon dioxide emissions, the largest contributor to climate change. 2, sheds light on blue carbon ecosystems and the need for restoration. And 3, is guided by principles of climate equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion. San Diego is rich in blue carbon coastal wetlands, and research has shown that coastal wetlands occupy less than 8% of global land area, but they store 30% of all carbon in their soils. The county must actively set out to remove carbon from the atmosphere and keep it stored for long periods of time. And coastal wetlands do just that. But coastal wetlands are at risk. In California, it's been estimated that 90% of the natural wetlands have been filled, drained, or altered. And when these wetlands are degraded or lost, they can transform from sink to source, releasing the carbon they've been storing back into the atmosphere. With only 10% of wetlands left in California, it's important that we protect and restore the ones that remain. A crucial step to doing that is better understanding blue carbon, and so I began my research with just that. Using sediment samples taken from Dr. Matt Costa here at Scripps and research from published literature, I quantified just how much carbon was being stored in some of the famous wetlands around San Diego. If you look to the last column, I estimated the carbon stock measured in metric tons of carbon per hectare of each site. Then, using a 2014 report, I found that San Diego County currently has around 2,157 acres, or 873 hectares of estuarine vegetated wetlands. Using this data, I was able to estimate the amount of total carbon stock for all of the county's wetlands. I found that the wetlands store over 160,000 metric tons of carbon. This amount is equal to the amount of carbon dioxide emissions it takes to power over 100,000 homes by electricity, and it's also equal to the amount of carbon sequestered by over 700,000 acres of US forest in 1 year. We can see that together, the wetlands within the county have an enormous storage of carbon. So, to inform the county on how best to utilize these ecosystems, I created an up-to-date inventory of the county's wetlands. Using literature and data from the last 50 years, I identified 11 estuarine ecosystems, all of which house coastal wetland habitats. In the inventory, I identified the factors integral to restoration, including characteristics of the habitat and the players that have a role in the management of these spaces. Then I discussed the past and present communities that are affected by any potential restoration efforts, as well as the major impacts from human activities. Lastly, I identified examples of restoration, the current status, and the ongoing issues within the county's wetlands. I found that the primary concerns facing almost all 11 estuarine ecosystems are sedimentation, sewage contamination, disruption to hydrology, and overall wetland loss. These issues stem primarily from centuries of land use change from agricultural, economic, and military development that began with the Spanish invasion. An example of these impacts can be seen at San Dieguito Lagoon today. Over the last century, the construction of highways, railroads, and dams have isolated a lot of these wetlands, changing their drainage function. This is true for San Dieguito, which was developed on to construct the Del Mar Fairgrounds, California Southern Railroad Line, the PCH, I-5, and Lake Hodges and Lake Sutherland Dam. These efforts completely changed the lagoon, reducing its water volume and eliminating natural habitats. Today, development has changed most of what used to remain in these ecosystems. In fact, approximately 31% of San Diego's historical estuarine habitats have completely disappeared. Now, for the last part of my research, I wanted to hear from the people of San Diego County themselves. I conducted a series of outreach meetings to speak with blue carbon experts and the County of San Diego to understand the landscape of wetland restoration and how the county can benefit from it. I also looked for examples around the US of climate action and climate equity. Then I met with community organizations dealing with environmental stewardship, restoring indigenous cultural connections, and empowering underserved communities. These discussions really reinforced the need to center conservation and wetland restoration around people and their well-being in order to achieve climate equity, but also to celebrate communities and their traditions. This quarter, I was able to see some of the themes and needs for my outreach efforts in action. I attended Wild Coast Coastal Cultural Day with their Coastal Leadership Internship program, which is a program that helps reconnect Indigenous youth with marine and coastal conservation. I was able to make a brief appearance through their tour of scripts and see firsthand the importance of meaningful connections and just joy with their ocean and coast. It really highlighted some of the many conversations I had that building authentic conversations, authentic relationships, having honest conversations, elevating BIPOC voices, and reconnection to nature are all first steps that we can actively take now. The culmination of this research and discussions led me to 5 main recommendations to the county. Number 1, prioritize historically excluded communities and celebrate cultural connections. Number 2, maintain ecological connectivity. 3, restore the pillars of wetlands, hydrological and sedimentary connections. Number 4, remember the past and plan for the future. And number 5, long-term research, monitoring, and prioritization. Today, I'm going to share with you just 2 of these recommendations, and to do so, let's walk through a case study of Kendall Frost Marsh Reserve in Mission Bay. Kendall Frost and the Northern Wildlife Preserve protect the last 40 acres of the 2,000 acres that used to be found in Mission Bay. Today, Kendall Frost is a tidal system and follows a classic vertical zonation from submerged shoreline to high marsh. Let's begin with my first recommendation, prioritizing excluded communities. First, it's important to acknowledge that Kendall Frost lies on the ancestral lands of the Kumeyaay, who once lived along the San Diego coast for many millennia. Not only did the Spanish invasion change the natural landscape, but it began the forced displacement and violence upon indigenous communities. The Kumeyaay remain displaced from their land today. At present, the communities surrounding Mission Bay are entirely different in people and nature. There remains significant disparities around racial and ethnic groups, which affect how the burdens and benefits of climate action are distributed. To address these barriers, I recommend the county define climate equity, environmental justice, and ensure that they are woven into the fabric of the new Climate Action Plan. The county should also foster long-lasting and meaningful relationships with low-income and BIPOC communities. For example, the county can lead wetland restoration that celebrates the Kumeyaay in restoring cultural connections. They can acknowledge the past through informed decision-making and education, and they can establish indigenous co-leadership of wetland restoration. Next, wetland restoration activities should occur within and alongside communities most at risk. The county is currently taking feedback on their climate action plan and holding public workshops. This is a great opportunity to create an inclusive process for engagement. They can do this by empowering community leaders, holding workshops in multiple languages, and providing participation stipends. Los Angeles County actually provided a really great example of this for their own sustainability initiative. They provided participation stipends and grants to community organizations and their staff who may not have been able to donate their time as fully otherwise, but their input is really crucial to the process. Another recommendation is remember the past and plan for the future. The county said it best. The most effective and inexpensive natural climate solution is avoiding land use change. And that is because natural, long-lived wetlands have larger carbon storages than newly constructed ones. Today, Kendall Frost is minimally disturbed from human activities, but any changes within the greater Mission Bay area can detrimentally impact the remaining wetlands. So, historic wetland habitats need to be preserved to avoid releasing additional carbon to the atmosphere that we can't afford. On the other hand, Kendall Frost must also be able to manage rising sea levels. So restoration needs to prioritize wetlands that have a high sediment supply, high initial elevations, and are next to natural spaces that will allow them to move landward in the face of sea level rise. Next, wetlands need all the help they can get. Integrating restoration efforts that boost its resiliency, like removing invasive species, will help a wetland remain where it is, and more importantly, keep carbon stored where it is. And lastly, there are so many reasons to restore a coastal wetland. So I think it's important that we create value indicators or reasons to restore a wetland that can help us determine where to begin. These are some examples of indicators that I think are top priority for wetland restoration. Adjacency to historically excluded communities, to provide outdoor access and protection from climate change, protection from sea level rise, potential to improve blue carbon capabilities, and the potential to support indigenous communities and celebrate connections. But there are many, many more indicators, and using these buckets, we can determine where we've come short in the past, what we need to prioritize in the future, and where to begin. Ultimately, coastal wetlands are a critical tool in fighting climate change. They not only support a more resilient climate, but they improve quality of life, they strengthen connections between people and nature, and they create more supported communities. Therefore, the County of San Diego must integrate blue carbon into their climate action plan in an effort that is representative, inclusive, and just for all San Diegans. First and foremost, thank you to my amazing committee for all of their guidance and encouragement throughout this project. Thank you to the participants of my outreach efforts, whose advice and generosity made this project move forward with ease. Thank you to Dr. Matt Costa for usage of his data and many meetings to understand how carbon sampling works. To Wild Coast, whose blue carbon conservation efforts inspired and guided this work. And lastly, to the MAS faculty and cohort for their continued support. Thank you. Any questions?
I've been fishing out of San Diego Bay for around 40 years. I've noticed a huge increase in the number of oysters now in the bay. Do you think those oysters and that shell stock is locking up carbon dioxide and the calcium carbonate?
Do I think they're contributing carbon?
No, not contributing, but sequestering carbon in the shells of the oysters.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. That's not my area of expertise, but I would assume that they are contributing some sort of climate mitigation role. I think oyster reefs and eelgrass beds are also important habitats that I actually mentioned in sort of the next steps of my report, that saving and protecting some of these other habitats are also really important for attenuating waves and also just the natural transition from lowland habitats to upland habitats. So I think they might have a role in that, but I'm not sure the amount that they're contributing. But I would say those are still really important habitats and ecosystems to continue restoring and protecting.
I'm guessing they're coming back because the water's cleaner in the bay, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's possible. I'm also not sure.
Or they're an invasive species.
Wonderful presentations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Is this on? I'm not an engineer, but what I hear is that as we think about strategies for defense along the coastline for sea level rise, that it would be far better to use a combination of natural systems and hardscape, that hardscape alone won't work. And I have wondered if that creates an opportunity for wetland restoration. Have you had an opportunity to look at that or think about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in my project I haven't had too much time to think about sort of the diversity of habitats that we should restore, but I think in sort of some of my literature review and talking a lot with wetland experts and blue carbon experts, having a variety of habitats, especially along the coast, is really integral to kind of tackling all the different issues, not just like sea level rise, but habitat loss and important habitats for species and biodiversity. So I think I would assume that, yeah, a diversity of habitats would be a great opportunity for shoreline protection and offer other opportunities for wetland restoration.
Has there been any effort made to generate carbon credits to help support conservation and research using these wetlands or other ecosystems?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. There have been, the conversation has just really started on voluntary mitigation credits for wetlands. I know Vera started sort of blue carbon mechanisms for wetland restoration. I think mangroves have definitely started in Southeast Asia, I might believe, but it's such a novel part of sort of carbon credits and something that still needs to be developed. I know there's a lot, it's really difficult to kind of estimate how much carbon is being sequestered because wetlands are so different depending on their habitats and where they are and their size. So we're really at the beginning of that research, but I believe one program for sure has been integrated into the voluntary markets.
So we've got a question on the YouTube channel from Tom Baker, and he has two parts to his question. Number one, how do wetland restoration efforts in California compare to those in other states? And are these efforts well supported by state and federal agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tom. I think wetland restoration, especially sort of like for compensatory mitigation efforts, has been more, I believe it's been more well thought out and planned on the West Coast. I think, what was the second part of the question, Samantha?
Are they well supported by state and federal agencies, these efforts?
Got it, yes. Well, I know that there's like a U.S. federal law of no net loss for, no net loss policy for wetlands. And that means that any wetland that is degraded or lost, there has to be a sort of mitigation effort to make up for the ecosystem services that they're providing. And I know that wetland restoration for mitigation efforts and compensatory efforts are definitely well executed statewide and nationwide. And I think probably like in the late 70s, we started realizing the importance of wetlands and how that's integrated. So I think there is support, but I would say in California, a lot of wetland restoration is, and probably across the US, is really limited by urban development, and a lot of our wetlands now are sort of isolated or constricted by human development. So that's something that we kind of have to tackle in the future of how we're going to continue expanding these places.
Great, and we've just got one more question from the web that I see. What recommendations do you have for the county that considers wetland restoration in the face of sea level rise?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely, as I mentioned, prioritizing restoration that has a high sediment supply will sort of help wetlands grow vertically. Strategies that we can think of to support that are maintaining tidal flow, maintaining freshwater flow, and making sure that the ebbs and flows of different habitats are connected to make sure that we're getting transport of sediment and material so these wetlands continue growing. As I said, also saving natural spaces next to wetlands, even if they aren't wetland habitats, are really important so that they can move landward in the face of sea level rise. And I think just overall, a lot of research on sediment dynamics and accretion rates would really help understand how wetlands are going to be impacted by sea level rise.
This is actually not a question, but I just wanted you to know that the US EPA is watching. And
Hello.
they want to talk to you and others involved in promoting wetland restoration. They work with the Army Corps colleagues in reusing dredge material for wetland restoration, and they'd like to connect with you.
That would be
I just
great. I
wanted
would
you to
also
know.
love that. Thank you.